Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Sarah Jane Demy of Demy-Colton, and on behalf of the Demy-Colton team, our sponsors, our supporters, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 20th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. Today, we will be speaking about strategic pricing for optimal valuation. As some of you know, Demy-Colton's mission is all about convening healthcare industry leaders from multiple disciplines to catalyze change in the healthcare space. Last year, at about this time, we were going to launch a meeting here in New York called BioFuture, a new conference, when COVID hit and changed our plans, as I'm sure it changed your plans. You've heard me say this before if you've attended one of our past salons. So we pivoted and we launched the Demy-Colton Salon Series to continue bringing people together with great content. And we know that even as we get out of COVID, that our virtual salon series will be here to stay. I urge all of you to check our website for the schedule of upcoming salons, and I encourage you to join us at future events. And moreover, I encourage you to join us at BioFuture in person and virtually here in New York City. That will take place October 5 and 6. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. I would like to thank Lattice Point Consulting, the sponsor for today's salon, our other virtual salon sponsors, and BioFuture's founding sponsors for their ongoing support. Before we start, I would like to talk about the structure of today's program. The formal discussion will last approximately 50 minutes, and it will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. You can submit your questions in the Ask a Question pane, which is below your screen, and we will address as many as possible. And I urge you to make your questions as succinct as possible, which will help us get through them. Please note that this salon will be recorded and it will be available for on-demand viewing later today. Additional materials can be viewed in the Event Resources tab. So now let's move on to today's salon. Strategic pricing for optimal valuation. We have a great moderator and a great group of panelists who think outside the box. We're really pleased to have them with us today. Our moderator is Ted Hack. He is Vice President of Lattice Point Consulting. And our panelists include Judy Campanari, Executive Director and Head of STAR at Alexion, and she can tell you what STAR means. Jessica Martinez, Senior Program Officer at Sciences Partnership at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dennis Purcell, the founder of Aisling Capital. And Lee Scott-Knight, CEO and board member, Moreo Biopharma. Now it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Ted. Ted.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
It's yours, Ted.
Great pleasure to be here, and we have a fantastic panel today. Really happy. We wanted to take a very broad view of strategic pricing. So we brought in some folks who have done pricing, some folks who have done business development and valuation, a CEO, an investor, and an investor board member. So we're really going to talk about this in as broad a fashion as possible. We're not going to get into too many tactics, but really help you think strategically about what we should do, when we should do it, in what forum, and how to move forward. And then we'll look forward to taking your questions at the end. So I'm going to go around the panel and just ask everybody to introduce themselves very briefly and just give a little bit of context of what exactly does strategic pricing mean to you. So for myself, I spent about 18 years in the pharmaceutical industry, both in financial roles as well as in market access roles. I joined Lattice Point about 5 years ago, which is a boutique consultancy for pricing and market access. It was founded by a 15-year Amgen veteran of pricing and contracting, and we just try to bring that experience to clients. I'm also an independent director and audit committee chairman for an early stage Belgian biotech. And what strategic pricing means to me from where I sit in the room is effectively you're just trying to monetize your value proposition. So we're taking into account the dynamics of the scientific evidence, we're taking into account our differentiation from competitors, and then we're taking into account ability and willingness to pay of whatever payer we're talking about in any given set. And so that's just a little bit of a frame from where I sit. I'm going to go around the panel from how I see people in my view, which may be different from your view. Jessica, a little introduction, if you would.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Jessica Martinez. I am a Senior Program Officer in the Global Health Strategy and Portfolio Management Organization at the Gates Foundation. I lead life science engagements and partnerships, as well as ecosystem shaping. And of course, when you think about the kinds of engagements that the foundation has with our pharma partners, access is, of course, top of mind. And as part of my ecosystem shaping remit, access to innovative therapies and sustainable financing efforts are key. Prior to joining the foundation, I was a senior member of Pfizer's corporate strategy team. I focused there on long-term risk management and revenue durability, as well as commercial model innovation. And prior to that, I was actually in the market access organization. So I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to this conversation.
And Jessica, from a context perspective, what's strategic pricing? What does that mean to you?
Strategic pricing is not letting the market dictate what your price should be because you don't have any other inputs. Strategic pricing means being proactive, being intelligent about pricing, and by intelligent I mean gathering intelligence to inform your pricing, and it means ensuring that you can defend your price with something other than just what the market will bear. And I think a lot of companies sometimes get pushed into certain kinds of pricing, and they don't necessarily have to be. There's a way to actually develop a pricing strategy proactively that can be both accretive to value as well as bring a lot of good reputational value as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Denise.
Great, I'm Denise Scott-Knight. I'm CEO of Mereo Biopharma. We are a company focused in oncology and rare diseases. And very clearly, rare diseases is a clear place where pricing is sometimes quite difficult, but obviously absolutely key to what we do. And for me, strategic pricing is really looking to match the clinical outcomes that we can achieve in our phase 2, phase 3 studies to inform the pricing, to see, where that price point should be. And this could be building the strategic pricing options for either direct commercialization or indeed for, a downstream business development deal.
Wonderful. Dennis.
Hey, thanks, Ted. My name's Dennis Purcell. I've been around the industry for a while, first at a firm called Hambrecht & Quist, and then most recently a venture capital firm called Aceling Capital based in New York, focused on the life sciences industry. I guess for me, Ted, strategic pricing, kind of two types of companies that we invest in. The early stage ones, which really have other types of problems other than strategic pricing at the beginning, but it becomes much more important as we get later on in terms of later stage investments. There the pricing assumptions and the like become much more important to us, because as we start to try to pencil out maybe what a market might look like, the price, if we assume a $10,000 drug and it's really a $5,000 drug, our net present value just went down by half. So as we move along the chain, it becomes much more important to us.
Super, thank you. And Judy.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Judy Campaneri, and I am the Executive Director, Head of STAR at Alexion Pharmaceuticals. STAR is an acronym that stands for Solutions to Accelerate Results, and then our tagline is for patients. We're Alexion's internal patient-centered think tank. My team and I spend our days thinking about how can we help the organization deliver results and think about our clinical programs that we're conducting or work that we're executing as a pharmaceutical company in order to improve the patient experience, the patients who are taking our medicines, the patients who are in indications that we discover and develop the medicines for, but also the caregivers and the doctors who are loving those patients living with diseases, who are caring or treating or managing those patients, and then also the payers who are making decisions about our medicines and our therapies. I've been in the industry for almost 25 years. Prior to Alexion Pharmaceuticals, Ted and I worked together hand in glove at Pfizer. And part of my job at Pfizer, I was in new product strategy at Pfizer and new product strategy previously at Alexion. But part of that role, I worked in mergers, acquisitions, licensing, and business development. And in that regard, for me, when I think about strategic pricing, it's really about deliberately and proactively thinking about the price that you want to set for your product in order to facilitate negotiations. When you look at a business development deal, price is often a lever that many want to pull, and the price of your therapy of a license or a total acquisition can often impact the overall negotiations. And so thinking strategically about the value of that product, the value of that deal, and how that price leads to the ultimate overall return on that value for that deal is something that I think is something you want to proactively, deliberatively think about and understand not just what the aggregate price is, but also what the value of the product is.
Wonderful. Thanks, Judy. And for the audience, we're going to have effectively 3 key takeaways after today that we hope you'll hear throughout our comments, but just to sort of put them in a finite manner. The first is to avoid the mistake of waiting to perform pricing, access planning as a baton pass. Once your clinical and regulatory strategy is set, then you go to pricing and access planning as part of commercialization. We're going to tell you why that's not a great idea. The second item, and we've already had a few comments toward that, is given them arguably, I don't know if you would argue it, massive impact that price has on your product valuation, whether you're trying to transact, trying to launch, trying to IPO, what have you. Doing things earlier is going to help you out. And then lastly, you don't actually have to spend an enormous amount of money to put some level of quality rigor into those sorts of planning deals. And it's just going to help you out in any of those paths that you go down. And so within that, we're going to start with the concept of timing. Denise, I'm going to kick off with you, if I may. Mareo's a really interesting story. It's a group of spun out products in rare and onco, as she mentioned. And you're public and you have a licensing partner and you have a true blue industry leader as your head of patient access and market access. So take us through the timing concept, how you thought, okay, guys, it's time to maybe get a little smarter on this and maybe do some work. Take us through what you were thinking about and how you went about it.
So it's an interesting story related to Sarah, actually. So our, in, I guess it was 2017-18. So we have an anti-sclerostin antibody for brittle bone disease or osteogenesis imperfecta. And we were just starting a phase 2 study, dose-ranging phase 2 study in adults using BMD as the endpoint, knowing that wasn't the pivotal fracture endpoint, but it was a dose-ranging study to pick the dose for the pivotal study. And having engaged with both the EMA and the FDA, and thinking through all the endpoints that we could include in a pivotal study, I then met Wills at a conference, Wills Hughes Wilson at a conference. And Wills was head of patient access and commercial planning at Sobi, and before that at Genzyme. And it suddenly came to me, really, this is the right moment. We're entering phase 2. We're going to be engaging with the regulators. And in Europe, you have the option, we're under the prime and adaptive scheme. So we have the option of engaging through what's called the MOCA scheme. They have a pilot scheme to engage with the payers during phase 2. And so it became very clear to me at that point that having somebody like Wills, first of all, to help us engage with these payers, but secondly, the patient access point and the patient's perspective. And when I talked at the beginning about, strategic pricing being for me about the clinical outcomes, one of the things that we've been doing here since Wills joined is actually having patients come in and talk to us about their disease. And so, for example, with osteogenesis imperfecta, a lot of people just think about the fractures and, the fact that these patients have lots and lots of fractures. But in fact, there's a lot more to the disease than fracture. And so we realized that there are a lot of other endpoints that we can put into our pivotal study as a result of these interactions that actually could help support the label and the pricing. And so, this was not only about developing the pricing model, but it was also about developing, what does this product need to do to support that pricing? And so it's been absolutely bringing that expertise in early into the company has been absolutely instrumental in our approach to this. And obviously, subsequently downstream, that helped us do the deal that we did with Ultragenyx, where we retain EU commercial rights.
Excellent. And so bringing in a senior person as opposed to a technician, I know that's a debate a lot of people go through. Yeah. Cash resources are finite, whether you're private or public, typically at this stage. Jessica, you've hired some folks, you've worked in the function, you've worked as a consultant to companies. Talk us through the kind of colleague that you think is going to help out in these types of situations. There are the more senior, the more junior. What works well? What are some pros and cons?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Ted. Thanks for asking it, because I think there is no one-size-fits-all answer. I'd love to be able to tell you that the person you should hire is X, but really it's situationally driven. In favor of the argument for hiring somebody that is more senior is, of course, oftentimes, despite the importance of price on valuations, it's a little bit of a challenge to bring the rest of the organization online and aligned with actually doing pricing studies and thinking about pricing so early on in development, or at least earlier than most older people in pharma tend to think about phase 3 work. So from that perspective, having somebody that can make the argument and can think through the way that the other senior leaders within the organization are going to be perceiving the argument for making this kind of investment is important. Having said that, though, you can't have somebody that is so senior that they're not willing to get their hands dirty. And that's the other crux of the matter, because at the end of the day, I think you're absolutely 100% correct when you say you don't have to spend a lot of money to do a lot of these great studies and analyses, but you do have to be nimble and you do have to be flexible. And it can't always be the kind of simple, let's do a payers survey and call it a day. It requires actually quite a bit of whiteboarding. So I guess the bottom line is that it depends on the phase and where you are from an organizational interest and an organizational acceptance of the need for this kind of assessment. If you have a well bought in organization, then by all means, bring in a workhorse, somebody who has the credibility with external stakeholders to be able to get the right answers and the way that the answers need to be received. But maybe doesn't necessarily need to make the argument in favor. If you are still struggling to bring along the rest of the senior leadership and colleagues on a decision to make this investment, then I think your better bet is to go with somebody who's a little more senior that can help make that argument.
Yeah, it's interesting. You guys have both brought up debate as well as what's effectively a Rolodex contact list on the external side. Judy, in terms of evaluating deals both internally and externally, you've also seen a variety of pricing colleagues come through, and I'm sure you've also seen consultants debate where a company either doesn't have them or has junior people. What comes across as credible to you? Is it purely the credibility of the argument, or do you really want to see if the company's thought about this? Are you seeing these debates, which are typically the sort of clinical versus market access in terms of trial design? The seniority matters, but who do you see and what's good? What are some things that you thought, maybe you guys need to work on this a bit more?
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about the deals I've been part of where price has been the major sticking point in the negotiation. There's one deal that comes to mind where my colleagues and I were not as familiar with the therapeutic area as the company that we were negotiating this particular asset with. And they presented a price to us from the get-go that was almost 3 times higher than what we assumed an acceptable price would be. And my pricing colleague, who was our internal expert, we sat down together with our HEOR, Health Economics Outcomes Research colleagues, did our own analysis, and came up with what we felt was a price that would not only be value-based, but would also be accessible in the various markets that we were looking at. Because this particular indication, there was varying levels of awareness of the indication and therefore acceptance. And the price that we felt that would be amenable across these markets was divergent. When we went into negotiations with this company, I will say that their pricing conversation did not come across as credible, because they were basically presenting it as the price they needed in order to return on their investment. And I think that would be my first cautionary tone. Quite frankly, you can set the price wherever you want. And oftentimes when you're looking at a business development deal, price is going to be your biggest lever, because that determines the value of the deal and therefore the value that the company is going to get from that deal. But if you are only looking at the bottom line in a negotiation and that kind of a transaction, you miss the opportunity to understand the downstream effect of the price. Because if that price is not going to be acceptable in a market, or if it's not going to be able to get past certain agencies, like in the UK, NICE, in Germany, ICWIC, or the Transparency Commission, then you're negotiating a deal that ultimately you can't deliver on. So for me, the credibility has got to be based on not necessarily the person, but on the analysis and the assumptions they're putting into that price. And what's driving that particular price? Is it really being driven based on the expected value, on the access, on the ultimate outcome that the product is going to deliver, or is it being based on the return on the investment that partner is expecting to get?
So it sounds like you're ambivalent to what the colleague looks like or who it is, internal, external. Just did you actually put some thought into this, as opposed to what some people call the beauty pageant price? Oh, that one looks good and that works for me. You want to see that somebody put some rigor.
I think
Dennis, pardon me, Judy, finish up.
No, I was just going to say one other thing around that, Ted, which is, when you can actually push in a conversation, and I'm not saying that you have to be obnoxious, but asking some smart questions about what are the assumptions behind a proposed price. And again, I'm thinking specifically around business development transactions. If they can't come up with clinically based, value driven, and I love Denise's answer to the question about what is the patient saying about the price, then that's where I would become a little suspicious and might push a little bit more.
Great. And Dennis, as an investor, board member, if somebody's coming to you in a preclinical company and say, "Hey, Dennis, we need a little bit of more cash to spend on this," how are you looking at this? When does it feel right for you to say we should put some money towards strategic pricing development and commercial development?
Well, certainly every time you raise money, I think you have to refresh what your thinking is on the pricing. What we're trying to start to push companies toward, though, is think about value instead of pricing. I think we didn't do a good job early on, like let's say Sovaldi, where we priced it. It was pretty easy that the value, the savings were really great. 84,000 versus 250,000, and I think now we're so focused, or generally we're so focused on price that we may have forgotten, about the value that we bring. And in some ways, we've turned over the pricing to ICER and the quality of adjusted life years in many cases. If you even look at what they did to Biogen a couple of weeks ago, with their drug 50,000 down to 5,000, and in some ways, we don't talk about this, but in some ways, maybe the high-priced drugs that we're putting out there are undervalued. Maybe they're worth more than that. And maybe some
That's
of the
an interesting thought.
Maybe some of the Me Too drugs are undervalued. You know, we're not talking about that. Maybe that big drug is really worth, high-priced drug is really worth something to the system, to the patient, and we're just not capturing that, and we're not telling the story properly. And then in other ones, it might be the exact opposite. We're charging more than it's really valued. So I'm beginning to think that this whole discussion, around price also has to include a value component. And in some way, we're going to have to wrestle away from ICER the ability to price our drugs going forward.
It's interesting you bring that up. I was working with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine yesterday in some lobbying on the Hill. And so talking to Senator Schumer's office and some New York State reps, there actually was a comment at some point about certain contracting solutions with Medicare. And they said, yeah, but we have disabled groups worried about qualities. And so that's sort of a new dynamic in the U.S. discussion. And so if we take this sort of argument, and you've also raised the sort of concept that volume is also valuable, if we just isolate everything towards price, we start ignoring volume, the general value discussion, but patient volume. Jessica, you've done a bunch of work on what's effectively revenue durability and trying to pull access a little bit deeper into the discussion in program discussions. So, we often have regulatory teams, clinical teams. Their incentives are on stage dates from a next clinical stage or getting a label or what have you, and this fast to label concept. And so can you take us through a little bit of what you sort of saw on how pricing and access impacted some of these things that had to do with forecasting and revenue durability and biases?
Sure, of course. And I have to laugh and smile knowingly when Dennis was making his point around the reintroducing the concept of value or introducing the concept of value to the U.S. markets and reintroducing it to, or continuing to try to introduce it to the international ones. Because yes, at the end of the day, there is a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of intra-company infrastructure that is developed around ensuring that the product is technically successful and around ensuring that the product will meet regulatory requirements. But there is very uneven infrastructure in place to ensure that it meets that access piece. And Judy hit the nail on the head. It's great to be that company that has that valuation that looks really pretty and Cinderella and everything, but at the end of the day, if you can't deliver, then what's it worth? And so we, in 2014, McKinsey put out a white paper that was specifically aimed at pharma and was saying, you guys are really bad at valuations that lead to really bad forecasting. And more than 50% of the time, you're wrong. The product, the value that the street says a product is worth, the value that you say a product is going to be worth is not where you actually end up. And what that manifests itself in, if you're sitting in a company like I was big drops in, or big gaps between actual revenues and expected revenues, or rather the other way around, expected revenues and actuals. And those lines just continue to go down every year and they never cross. There's always what we call the fade. And so we wanted to understand more about that fade because there was a lot of chatter within the company around what's contributing to this. Do we have competitors that we weren't aware of, or competitive dynamics that we're not prepared for? And at the end of the day, when we looked at the data and looked at our own pipeline and then looked at the broader landscape of pharma over the course of the kind of, call it 5-year period, surrounding that 2014 article, what we found is that the fade is actually characterized by 3 key drivers and dynamics. The first one is pipeline risk, because even though we're really good, or pharma thinks that they're really good at pipeline risk assessment, what you're really doing is averages of averages, right? And trying to apply laws of averages to very small numbers of products, and you're inevitably not going to get it right. And you know what? What our analysis showed is that that's true. for the most part, the fade is not the result of clinical trial failures or pipeline risk. Only about 20%, if you're looking at the whole landscape of pharma, is the result of pipeline risk. And then you're thinking, okay, well, launch risk. Well, maybe we're being too optimistic. Maybe there's optimism bias. And what I'll say is the other sort of 30% of the fade was actually a combination of inefficient launches, optimism bias, although that was less of an issue. It's more along delays. So there is an importance to ensuring the technical success of a product, because those delays do end up costing you something. But the vast majority, or 55 to 60%, so maybe not the vast majority, but a very large chunk of that revenue fade was the result of downside commercial risk. And it was not competitive dynamics. It is entirely around pricing. And you can call it access, you can call it reimbursement, you can call it mispricing. But at the end of the day, pharma is trying to price, and biotechs are trying to price a product in a very dynamic environment with macroeconomic downsides and with payers who are constantly moving the goalposts, because Sovaldi, as Dennis mentioned, should have been exactly what the payers were looking for, and yet here we are still talking about it. So if you think about downside risk, and if you think about long-range forecasting, yes, it is important to create that infrastructure to manage your pipeline risk. And yes, it is important to ensure that you're being clear-eyed about your valuation so that you're not overestimating the launch efficiency. But at the same, but ignoring or not putting in place the infrastructure to manage that pricing risk really leaves you wide open. There's a very big gap there. And that's really where most of your revenue fade comes from. And that, by the way, is not just Pfizer. That's the whole industry. If I look at IMS data for the entire industry, that is mirrored exactly as we found. Maybe the percentages vary a bit, but it's the same theme.
And roughly speaking, per annum loss, what kind of percent are we talking about?
It depends on the therapeutic area. If you're talking about more well-served primary care space, the fade is roughly around 3 to 5%. If you're talking about per annum, exactly. So 3 to 5% on your full forecast is a huge amount. It's even scarier if you're talking about oncology, rare disease. That goes up to 7 to 10%. So it's a significant argument in favor of proactive and early investment and ensuring you're getting your pricing right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Denise, as a CEO, how does that make you feel?
I hope.
That's a scary number. And, I completely understand what Jessica's saying, but, clearly there's a tension there, right? Because to get this right, you have to make all this investment before you get your pivotal data, right? And I'm feeling that tension now because, we're talking about access people, medical affairs, and you're talking about adding resource, adding infrastructure before you have your pivotal data. And we all know you need to do it. But actually, making that significant investment and that commitment, it's tough to do. And, I had to stand up with Wills, with the board and get alignment on this investment. And it's tough ahead
so you got pushback at the board level.
Yeah, it's tough, I guess. We're building the plan. We're doing what we can now with the resources that we have now, and you were talking earlier about consultants versus a senior person in the organization. One of the benefits of having a senior full-time person come in and do this early is you've then set that culture within your organization. So everybody then gets buys into this. This is how we're going to do things going forward. This is really important. But there is definitely that tension with that investment. It's a sizable investment, and it's a risky investment ahead of data. So we are living this live.
Ted, can I follow up on that?
Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here and I'm having flashbacks to discussions and debates that I've had with some of my C-level colleagues, the C-suite, about transactions we've done. And it gets to what Jessica was talking about, that commercial risk. The easiest way to get to a valuation that everybody is going to be, I'm going to put this in quotes, happy about, is to, again, pull that pricing lever. Because, until you have your marketing plan and you're executing it in the marketplace, until you've got your clinical data and you know what the efficacy and therefore the benefit and risk ratio is going to look like, the uncertainty around those parameters is something I think that from a pharmaceutical perspective, we are willing to, to sort of put on the back burner. We just don't know, so we're not going to guess. But price has always been that thing we want to play with. I remember back in our
it's an
Pfizer
ego
days,
play, isn't it?
Yeah. I remember back in our Pfizer days where I used to joke with somebody that I can make anything a $1 billion drug. All I need is a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Give me a spreadsheet. And I can make anything a $1 billion drug. The problem is
anything times 0 is 0.
Yeah. And so I think for me, there's one of the things that we have to be willing to do as analysts. So I'm going to talk to the people on the call who are analyzing and presenting data. You've got to be willing to put your hand over your heart and sometimes give hard truths. And in those hard truths is the old famous tornado chart. I think that is your biggest benefit and your biggest tool is what's the upside and downside? What's the sensitivity analysis of your pricing strategy? Because sometimes you'll find out that price really isn't the lever. There are other things that you have to get right. And so if price is not going to matter, take it and put it on the back burner. But if it does, then make sure you've got your assumptions dead on accurate, or when, as I say, the wheels are going to fall off the bus. What happens? What scenario? What is that thing that makes the price change in order for you to be less than comfortable? And I think that it's really communicating those hard truths. And so, Denise, if we were in a corporate boardroom right now, my presentation to you would be, Denise, here's what you're going to have to believe. Here are the scenarios. Here's the sensitivity analysis. And this price can set you up for success, but all of these other attributes have to fall in line. And I think that conversation is a really important one to have, whether you're talking about a transaction or you're talking about an internal candidate, because then you mute and blunt the impact of price, and you can mitigate sometimes that commercial risk if you've got your assumptions correct and you know which assumption is going to make that lever of sensitivity change.
Hey, Dennis, you and I have talked about, shorting launches, and, it sounds like we have a little bit of we just quantified why you may have done that over and above your own analyses. For single technology companies, I mean, this to me hits me like a huge risk, but how do you think about this?
Well, it seems to me the whole world is kind of like uncertain right now. I mean, you got 3 players right now on the payer side that own 75 or 80% of the market with that, and then CVS and United, and they all own their own PBM. They all own their own specialty pharma. They all own their retail pharmacy. They all own the distributor. And going back to the volume question, it seems to me they're taking incredible steps to limit volume of new drugs. So, like if you look at the way the exclusion list, say relative to 3-4 years ago, it's up about 6x. 6 times the number of drugs are excluded today than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And if you look
at because of choice too, right? I mean, there's more choices.
Yeah, and co-pays are through the roof. So these 3 people that own so much of the market really are kind of calling the shots right now. So for us, as we think about it, it's pretty uncertain. So we have to know that we have to understand whether they have levers they can pull to kind of restrict our drug or not. Can they manage it or can't they? To date, they haven't not been able to manage cancer or orphan diseases. They've had to kind of take it as is, but we're starting to see that change also.
Well, I guess the other side of, these negotiation things, it's not just an ex-US thing where people can say, oh, it's 30% of my business, the US is 60, 70%. So if something gets delayed 12, 18 months in negotiation, it's fine. The US is great. And now we're seeing, well, actually the US, you're going to have to work a little harder at some of these things. When we go to, so, we've talked a little bit about transactions and, we're now in the age of gene therapies coming along. And people talking in nice big round numbers because they're easy to get your head around. So $1 million price, couple million, $1 billion values. Judy, you've seen these in a variety of settings, and you talked about it a little bit further. But can we take a little bit further of when somebody's thinking about out licensing to you? Do you think they're really having that robust conversation, or what are the 2 or 3 things you would tell them? Please do this before you visit a big biotech or a big pharma, because the evaluation team has the wherewithal or what have you. Know what you're getting into. So can you give us a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, are we thinking gene therapy, large molecule, small molecule, or all the above?
Let's talk orphan rare onco. Let's stay in the high cost side of the room. So orphan rare onco, these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think the first thing to think about is what's your value proposition? What are you selling? One of my favorite quotes is, price is what you set, but value is what you get. And I think that once you understand the value, then you understand your negotiation. You understand where you can really tweak that lever, where you can pull the lever. And the understanding the value proposition allows you to then wait for the data to evolve. So understanding what the clinical expected outcome is going to be, and that based on that clinical outcome, in line with the safety and side effect profile, what does that overall product profile look like? What is that product going to be delivering to the patients? And I want to harken back to something Denise said earlier. What's the patient expecting? What does the patient say they need? Because sometimes we think that as drug developers, we know what the patient needs and wants. Well, validate that. And then based on that, you can come into a conversation with price and knowing what you're really pricing against. So I'd like to know, if I were going into negotiation, what's my walk away? The price I'm setting is based on this part of the value, this part of the benefit, but assuming where there's going to be some downside risk, or there's going to be risk associated with the safety profile, or quite frankly, sometimes you have to look at the drug delivery system. We're seeing that sometimes what you assumed was going to be a once weekly sub-Q auto-injector is really turning into being a large on-body device, not an auto-injector. That can also affect the overall perception of value and utility, and therefore the price. And also, not to go down this rabbit hole, but when you start talking about devices, that cost of goods is also going to add up to your price. All of those pieces of the puzzle, I think, are critical before you'd walk in and say, here's the price. The last thing I would say is, in this part of the drug development ecosystem, I hate to talk about price as a finite number. I think you've got to have a range, because again, we're talking, Jesse brought this up, we're talking about risk. So what is that walkaway price at both ends? The walkaway, which is, you can't get above that, but then also the walkaway for my C-suite colleagues, the number you need in order to get that return on investment.
Jessica, is it always about the science? I mean, what right? Value, I think a lot of people sometimes get hung up. It's, when you and I have had this conversation, it's their baby, right? Discovery is really difficult. We know that. But is it always about the science? I mean, when you look at a transaction, we have generics, we have biosimilars, we have all sorts of people, looking at different things. Is it always the science?
I mean, I would love to be able to say, as Denise did, that yes, it is about the science. You need the price to match the value. And I love Judy's quote. I'm going to borrow that if you don't mind. The value is what you get. And so does the science deliver? So I think we have to make a distinction between very cool science versus science that actually delivers. So the very cool science, the really interesting platforms, there's a different kind of approach to evaluating them versus a new kind of therapy that is based on interesting science and can actually demonstrate whatever it is that it's supposed to with the hard numbers. When we talk about the platforms and the really cool science, I think we need to remember that 2 years ago at this time, people thought the mRNA platforms were cool science that nobody wanted to really invest in. So I think that there's a lot of interesting value in talking about chemistry platforms and programmable therapeutics. And there is a value that should be attached to those. And so if you're thinking about investing in these cool platforms, then yes, science obviously has to be sound. Does that mean that you can easily translate it into price? No, because we're really talking about these very, very early investments. And there probably isn't a product at this point, or if you are, it's very, very early on. So let's put that aside and just think about the science for the therapeutics. I think it depends, again, on the payer that you're talking to. If you're talking to a monopsonistic, highly sophisticated HTA payer, and I'll sort of use Europe as an example, the NICEs, the IQWICs, some others that think of themselves as that way. Yeah, you need to have the science buttoned up because, like it or not, your science has to plug into a very clear model. If you're talking about the situation that Dennis was talking about, which is a quasi-monopsonistic situation in the US where you have 3 payers that are seeking to control the market, then no, the science is actually often an afterthought, sadly. And we'd like it to not be the case. And I think, I won't necessarily go as far as to say, hey, let's scrap ICER and let's scrap these other efforts. But at the same time, they don't have the share of voice that they should have. And so they're not as useful as they could be. And you find yourself in a situation where science is sadly taking a back seat to all of the other economics that Dennis was noting when a company owns the entire vertical or when a payer owns the vertical.
So let me split your science comments to a one level lower. Does modality matter if you say, but I'm gene, but I'm a monoclonal antibody, I'm not a small does any of that matter? Or is it just, when you say the science, is it modality? Is it outcome? What matters the most? What should people think?
In that latter piece that I was talking about, it's all outcome. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, though, modality does matter for the reason that Judy just mentioned. It can certainly affect your costs. And so, no one is a cost plus pricing, and no one's advocating cost plus pricing, but you do have to take that into account, not just for the point of view of pricing, but then also more practical considerations like manufacturing.
Yeah, so when you look at the science, though, and let's put on gene therapy on the table now, the promise of gene therapy is that we can finally use the C word, cure.
Yep.
And if you can't cure, then you're not putting that patient from being a patient living with a disease to the person living a normal life. And that's what that the gene therapy promises. Now, I think that we are in a really murky place with gene therapy and pricing because we have yet to see the promise that we have speculated scientifically. And I think gene therapy is a really exciting place. It is still, at this point, my personal opinion, speculative, because the data has not yet given us enough confidence that gene therapies and all gene therapies actually cure disease, i.e. change the gene mutation to being, quote, normalized so that this person is living a normal, regular life. And, even more is the veracity of that length of that cure. I mean, there's some data that suggests that these gene therapies may only have a 5-year time frame until you actually see the body go back to that original genetic mutation. And so I think that's the, if you're going to talk about, and I know I'm saying this anecdotally, $1 million price for a gene therapy, you better be delivering on the cure, because what you're paying for are the downstream savings of costs.
Yeah. Denise, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about Judy's, suggestion of the bottom and the top of the range for the pricing. And, to some extent with setrusumab, our brittle bone product, if we help fractures, that's the key. But then there's, as I said, through interactions and, speaking to all the patients, if we could help pain and bone pain and help mobility on top of that, that's a whole different ball game. And so, I do agree that there's a range there, but we do have, a bottom of the range, which is the fractures, because just doing that alone is sufficient to, to price this at one level, and it's additive on top. And those, going back to the clinical outcomes, this is where the feedback loop and having, somebody involved very early on, like Will's, we're able to build these additional things into our pivotal study because we have that thinking early on. Yep. And so, that's going to be incredibly important downstream.
So we have about 2 minutes left before we get to Q&A. I just want to come back to one comment that Judy made, and then we'll go over to Dennis about investors in the street. And with respect to gene therapy, Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA director, spoke to the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine folks, and this is 3 or 4 years ago as well, and said, look, we're less concerned with efficacy in a simple sense of gene editing, gene replacing with a functional gene. Conceptually, we understand that people have been able to show it. You can't fake that in real life. Our concern is consistency in manufacturing and safety. And 3 and 4 years on, he's still bang on correct, isn't he? And so that's just something, talking to a former colleague who has been a country manager and is now in a gene therapy company, he said, some of your worst days as a country manager negotiating price is because you have a factory problem. Mm-hmm. And you can say, well, that has nothing to do with price. But guess what? If you can't deliver the goods and you're asking for a huge price, that's not a fun discussion. And I don't think that comes out sometimes.
Yeah. So Ted, I think the other thing is that, going back to the pricing, and especially in these orphan and rare diseases, where a lot of companies are trying to get their products approved and reimbursed on the back of biomarkers, right? And that is a whole, that's a very, very difficult place to go in terms of pricing.
Yeah. So Dennis, we had some conversations about, some potential disconnects between investors or the street and some companies, and you had a couple of stories about, seeing an analyst report and actually talking to a payer. Tell us what you saw and heard, and maybe what some companies should think about.
Sure. And point well taken, just 30 seconds before I get there, point well taken, Judy, on where the whole industry is. But Scott Gottlieb also said that kind of mid-decade, we're going to have, 25 or 30.
20 to 25 per annum. Yep.
Per annum. And what did the FDA approve last year? 50. So that's going to be a huge, plus or minus 50 in any given year. So
plus the COVID backlog. So it's
we're going to see a bunch of $1 million drugs coming down the pike. But I think what Ted's describing is that I was in a board meeting and we had an investment in a company called Aspirion, which is involved in the PCSK9 world. And we were doing some work about whether we should continue to hold the stock or invest more or get rid of it or whatever. And, we had high hopes for it. Chris Viehbacher from Sanofi, the CEO, said it was going to be the most exciting launch he had ever seen. So we were pretty pumped, and the data looked pretty good. And on the other side of me was a guy who was the chief medical officer of one of the large plans. And I asked it, and the street was saying it's probably $1 billion drug in the first year, billion. And that wasn't just one person. That was like the consensus on the street. And at $14,000 per year. And the chief medical officer said, I asked him, I said, what do you think about that whole class? And he said, I like it. It's a great class of drugs. He said, but it's a $4,000 drug, not a $14,000 drug. And that's where it hit me that the street investors are not in sync with the payers in many cases. I don't know. This is a couple of years ago now, so I don't know if we're getting closer or not. But, the payers had no intention of paying $14,000. So I don't know how we got there. But it certainly kind of screwed up the launch of that class of drugs.
So, Sarah, I think I see you're back on screen, so I think we're turning over to you for a few minutes.
Well, you will all still be involved because it's Q&A time. So, so for anybody who is with us that now has to leave, I thank you very much for joining us for this portion of our discussion, and we'd like to move on to Q&A. And I'd like to start with a rather big question. It comes in from one of our viewers from a biotech company. And the question is, the Sovaldi pricing brouhaha was mainly driven by the fact that so many Hep C patients are covered by Medicaid. How important is being mindful of who is paying for the drug pricing? There's no doubt that $80,000 for a Hep C cure is worth it. But how do you price it? Ted,
tell us about book of business.
I'm pinging it over to you so that you can bring your brilliant panelists in to add their wisdom to this.
Jessica, tell us about book of business.
Oh, God. Yeah, you do have to. The book of business matters. There is the rule of thumb that we used to have at Pfizer, which may or may not still be the case, but it illustrates the point. Your commercial business is twice the size of any of your other books of business. So it's twice the size of your Medicare, which then is twice the size of your Medicaid. And that recognition, or that dynamic, is a recognition not of how many patients sit in each of the books of business, but rather of the pricing potential within them. So it's very, I'm sure now with Part D and a much more enlarged Obamacare, that rule of thumb probably doesn't hold, but the spirit of it still does, which is that you do have to pay attention to your book of business. And the Sovaldi example certainly does explain that. And also the fact that there was a very large bolus of patients that were going to get it from the start.
Yeah, one of the other dynamics of book of business that I think people think about is people think more when they say government, they think Medicare, which is generally retiree older populations. When you look at genetic and rare diseases, and this is important for the gene therapy folks, a lot of children, because of this is a U.S. situation, because of the American Disabilities Act, a lot of those gene therapy kids are actually going to be Medicaid coverage. And so, if I have $1 million, well, I already have mandatory discounts and some other dynamics that go in. And I'm not sure that's everybody's thinking that way. I know somebody else, because of the genetic predisposition, it happened to be highly prevalent in Navajo Indians. And so all of a sudden you're talking about Indian services, which no one ever talks about. So the book of business is really important, and just saying, well, it's Medicare and that's still pretty good. No, actually, you really need to understand how big is Medicaid. So it's a fair point. Any other thoughts, Judy, Denise, Dennis, on this?
How was it covered in Europe? How was Sovaldi covered in Europe?
Central government. Nice. I think it's important. I think this is lost on people because of the big cost kerfuffle. So we used to sell interferon at Shooting Plow. Big black box, a suicide helpline, right? I mean, it was a difficult drug and low compliance, but it still cured people with a pretty high rate. The orals came along; they're fantastic. When you went to Europe, NICE gave it a glowing report. I think people automatically assume everything's negative. NICE gave it a very good report. This is one of those situations where budget impact really started to matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right? Interferon was a 2-year process. This was now going into a few months.
Thank you. Thank you. So here we have a great question, and let's see how we answer it. One is, how do you determine pricing for therapeutics and drugs in the new psychedelic space? Okay.
Are psychedelics on offer at the start?
We'll start with you, Ted. Come on.
I've been raised, and my experience, I think, would suggest that if any companion diagnostic or testing or other components, services, the general payer feedback is whatever, quote, you need to do to get that drug to be efficacious, that's your problem and your money, right? And so to pay for things a la carte is not terribly common. I forget it was Judy or Denise brought up devices and certain types of some of these fancy syringes and self-inject devices. That and the payer community is a cost of good. I would tell you the upside is if it's and I've had this debate as well. People say, well, I have a cooler device. I have a nicer device. It's easier to use, the smaller needle, what have you. I should take the price up. And my comment is, no, you should take the volume up, because this is now a differentiation point. So it's hard to give more specific advice on what's a precise therapeutic area without, I don't understand the outcomes, all the comments we've heard today. So without understanding, it's very hard to say, but generally speaking, these concepts, it's not bundling in the payer sense, but it's whatever you need to get there. That's your problem. We pay for the value of the outcome. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody else has a thought or a comment on that.
No, I would agree with you, Ted. I think that we used to price based on all of the widgets associated with the med, but now, again, as you shift to value-based pricing, and this is the whole concept of strategic pricing, it's the whole outcome and benefit to the patient and that experience that they're going to have from being on your therapy, irrespective of how it's administered or delivered. I mean, I think back in the mid-90s, where we were, at least in the small molecule space, thinking about, and innovation was taking a medicine from 3 times a day, twice a day, to being once a day, or flash tabs and all those new technologies. Those were the days where you could price to that. Now that those methodologies are means to deliver the benefit, so therefore the endpoint and the outcome is more important.
Right. Yeah, I know there's a couple countries who give maybe €5, €10, the de minimis amount, but it's not, okay, let's price the device as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just to round that question out a little bit, I think psychedelics are now being used and are being tested to treat PTSD, depression, and many other, mental health issues, pain as well. So
I think partnering with the Veterans Affairs Association in the U.S. or the Department of Defense, state Medicaid, we just talked about Medicaid, but I think those organizations, given how the socioeconomic dynamics behind a lot of this occur, I think there's quite a lot of partner possibilities to have a good payer discussion about what they need and what they're receptive to. Yeah. It's a very interesting area to explore, but there's not a lot of experience in this field just yet.
Right. At least formally, there's not a lot of experience.
No, there's an interesting analog here, though, and I would point to Botox. Back in the day, Botox was cosmetic, and there was a lot of pushback on covering Botox, and this is a U.S. perspective, but covering Botox because it was seen as a lifestyle drug. It was cosmetic. But then when Botox got approved for migraines and the outcome and the benefit was proven, now you get into a conversation of what's the value of the product, not so much the almost a philosophical conversation of does a person really need Botox? So I think that's sort of, for me, the parallel here, which is you're looking again now at it's delivering a benefit for something that has been medically identified and diagnosed.
Great point. Denise, did you want to add? I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with Judy. I mean, it's going to be all about, and Ted, it's going to be all about the outcomes, and having the right outcomes.
Yeah.
Well,
And I know there's somebody in another, it's also a service with occupational therapists, physical therapists, and all, in musicology, to work with people with multiple sclerosis, various neurological motor neuron issues. And, they're thinking about it as a holistic treatment, and they're doing it with a trial and based on the outcomes of the whole package. And so I think that's a very forward-thinking way to do it, and reasonable.
Okay. Thank you all for that. So here's another question that's going to focus again on gene therapies. And the questioner asks, how do you believe that manufacturers could address that uncertainty on the promise of cure in front of investors when being at a very early stage in clinical development? That's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Dennis is I get to start?
Yeah, Ted, you get to, you're the moderator.
I'm going to ask Dennis as our lead investor of today's panel. What's convincing to you? We know hope is not a strategy. So what's convincing to you when somebody says, I need significant money, it'll only be a few patients, don't worry, we can charge $1 million or $2 million for the therapy in the 10 or 15 years it's going to take to get there?
I think over the last number of years, the goalpost has changed from the investing. It used to be proof of concept, then it was filing with the FDA or approval, and then all of a sudden pricing has become such a big deal, as we discussed today. And we paid very little attention to manufacturing up until, recently, when we've seen all the problems. And I don't think, from the investing standpoint, it's so complicated that I don't think any of us have a good handle on it yet. Although we are seeing some private equity and venture firms make significant investments in the manufacturing of cell and gene therapy. Whether it's going to pay out or not, we don't know, but it's tough to judge at this stage. All I know is that we're paying more attention to it.
Yeah. So Ted, one thing about this is I'm forgetting the company now. I'm having a massive senior moment, but it's the pay for performance. So a couple of years ago, one of the very first companies that came out with a gene therapy actually said to the payers, you know what, give us this price up front, and in X years' time, if Y% of patients don't respond, then we'll give you back a portion of what you've allowed us to charge for this product. So pay for performance is that sort of, it seems to be the stopgap strategy to get past the uncertainty of the promise of gene therapy. I'm not advocating pay for performance, but I think that that's right now where we are as an industry and the conversation around price. Because the promise of gene therapy is cure on all meanings of that word. And if you can deliver that, then the indirect costs of a patient living with that disease are mitigated. The direct costs of that patient living with that disease are mitigated. And that's what you're paying for, is the future reduction of those costs. And you're front loading that with your, again, putting this in quotes, $1 million price. So I think pay for performance is one strategy. It's the only one that I'm familiar with in these promise of gene therapy. As we get more data, and as the data is actually proven to be sustainable, meaning the benefit is sustainable, you might see more pay for performance strategies being implemented.
Jessica, you've seen some of this. How widespread has it been, and how widespread do you think it could be?
I mean, this is the very definition of strategic pricing. This is why you engage in strategic pricing. It is to be able to make that argument proactively. And whether it's a pay for performance, a capitation, a clawback agreement, at the end of the day, if you're asking someone to pay for the promise of something that you can't demonstrate, but that you have good evidence might be there, and this is, of course, to protect both you and whoever it is you're asking to pay for the product, then you must also build in an escape hatch. And there are a number of different innovative ways of doing that. And I've seen everything from exactly what you were saying, Judy, to diminishing costs. So the longer somebody is on, the longer it takes to actually cure someone, then the costs get lower every year and things like that. There are a lot of mechanisms. And this is where it's really useful to look at Europe and Canada. There's been a long history, at least a 10, 15-year history of innovative engagements and agreements that address this very specific issue, and also proof of concepts that they work.
Let me make 3 quick points. So I'm knee deep in this with some folks. With the hope of the cure, that requires continuous data and evidence generation. So there's an investment in data to come, right? So it's not great, we got a label, we're done. No, it's got to keep going, whether registry or interventional or otherwise.
Absolutely.
Second, and this is some of the discussions we had yesterday with folks in Congress and the Senate, is the payment models over time, they're seeing uptake, but they're somewhat limited, right? It comes back to this, does it make sense for your counterparty? And let me talk about administrative burden. There are 11, I just gave these stats yesterday, there's 1,100 regenerative medicine companies as of January 2021. There are 600 trials in phase 2 in regenerative medicine and 150 in phase 3. So if you just think about yourself in a silo, but it's just, you and me, dear payer, doing this. No, they have to accommodate what could be, if we take 50% of those as hits, a couple hundred other companies. And so way back when at Pfizer, we tried an outcomes contract with one of our bigger products, broke out the actuaries, all the outcomes, modeled all this out, and everybody said, that's great. And the payer said, by the way, you need to compensate me for the 5 FTEs I have to hire to administer this. So why don't you just give me 3 more points on the rebate instead, and we just call it a day. So you really have to do that. And the last point I'll make, especially this is sort of the single technology gene type of colleagues, if you're public, talk to your auditor and your tax person, because you will not sell $1 million in revenue. It's going to be something discounted because you have a failure rate. It's like a warranty, right? Or an uncollected account. You're going to have deferred revenue, right? You're going to have disclosure requirements, and you're going to have tax implications. So there's, it's like, don't wait till the last minute to talk to your lawyer. Don't wait till the last minute to talk to your tax attorney or your auditor either, because there's big impacts. Denise, I think you had a comment.
No, what I was going to comment on was really, if you take the conditional approval model, and, as Judy said, look at pay for performance, but the conditional approval model, conditional payment model, and then go out into the big wide world and prove, as you treat more patients that that this is really worth this price. I think that's a good way to go. And I think it was Europe that has developed this pay for performance model, actually. And, there's got to be some mechanism like that, because, these gene therapies, we've got to show the durability. And they're being approved on very, very limited data sets. It's not, we're not looking at thousands of patients showing the reality of the data. So you've got to have some sort of conditional model to make this work.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end. We have, I believe, 1.5 minutes left. So for a very complicated issue, I'm going to ask this question, and Ted, why don't you take this one? Or maybe it's Denise who takes it. It's for orphan diseases. There used to be a relationship between prevalence and pricing. Is that still the case, considering the revenue for the CF drugs? $7 billion.
Okay,
I have some thoughts, but Denise, why don't you start?
You start, and I've got a view on that.
Okay.
You want me to start? I would argue early on, and you can find this in the public domain. The price and prevalence actually wasn't related necessarily. If I look across countries of the early ERT days, enzyme replacement therapy days, the U.S. was not the highest price. So even these traditional things of the U.S. is the highest price, then maybe Germany or other.
Yep.
It was a bit of a hodgepodge. Prevalence per se, I know some of the HTA authorities, I know the Germans especially had done a few studies and showing that's actually distinctly not the case. And so it was one of the things that I know, Wills has had some writing on this. I've done some input of, is that what we want? And maybe it isn't, and this goes back to our early comments, depending on the outcome, something with, a higher volume could still have a much higher value to the patient and the outcome because they're mobile, or, we had a discussion with somebody and said a good outcome is the kid actually getting into a wheelchair, because then they'll actually go outside and socialize.
Okay,
right? Not being in a wheelchair. So yeah, Denise, your thoughts.
I agree with that. I think it's, at the end of the day, I don't think it's about the prevalence. I think it's about the outcome. It's about the value that drug brings to the patient. It's not about the prevalence.
Okay, everybody, I think that is our last question for the salon. We're just a little bit over time. So I thank all of you. Drug pricing is such a complicated question on many different levels. I thank Ted, Judy, Jessica, Dennis, and Denise for shedding some light on this. And I know that there are a number of unanswered questions. We will work with Ted to see what kind of quick answers we can give those people with the unanswered questions. So I'd like to thank Point Consulting for sponsoring this event, and our previous virtual salon sponsors, as well as our founding by future sponsors. And we would like to thank the audience for joining us. Thank you very much for signing on to hear this. Please join us next week for our next virtual salon, Investing at the Speed of Innovation. That should be an exciting one. It takes place on May 26th. With that, we're signing off. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Thanks,
Bye
Sarah.
now. Bye.